Hey everyone, welcome back to This Is Monsters. I'm your narrator, Giles with a J. I just want to take a quick moment to let you know that we're on season 21 and the theme is strange and unusual. I feel like I might have been a little too aggressive in my previous intro and I want to make things a little more positive, so I'm going to encourage you to caress the like button and maybe hug the subscribe button. Show it some love. Don't hate. Save your hate for the monsters. On with the show. On the evening of October 17th, 2006, at around 8:30 p.m., a 28-year-old former sergeant in the United States Army named Zachary Bowen jumped from the 7th floor of the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel in New Orleans, Louisiana. Needless to say, he did not survive the fall. But while that was a tragedy in itself, it would only prove to be the tip of the iceberg when it came to the true horror of the situation. That's because once his suicide note was found, it would tell police to go to his apartment, as it was there they would discover the remains of his girlfriend Addie Hall. She had been murdered by him weeks before, then subsequently chopped up and cooked in their oven. Immediately upon finding that scene, investigators began trying to determine how such an incident could have occurred. What they'd eventually realized, though, was that the case was more than just a simple murder. No, it was a complex tale of violence, mental instability, and the damaging effects of untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, and one that might have been avoided had circumstances been just a little bit different. This is Monsters. Zachary Bowen was an average American child growing up. Born on May 15, 1978, he spent much of his youth in Bakersfield, California, with it being there that he gained a reputation for his laid-back and charming personality. Someone who loved to joke around with his friends as much as he loved to go to metal gigs and let loose for a few hours. Of course, behind that exterior, though, there was a troubled young man, one who struggled with depression throughout high school. But then it's not uncommon for a teenager to fall into depression when their parents get divorced, as Zachary's did around that time. So to try to get a fresh start and get his head right again, he moved away from California with his father during his late teens, as by that point his relationship with his mother had degenerated pretty badly. From there, the pair would travel around the United States, visiting various party places before eventually settling in New Orleans. Once in the Big Easy, things seemed to improve for a while. Indeed, Zachary would ultimately drop out of school, but that didn't mean he had no future ahead of him. After he left the educational system, he found work as a bartender on Bourbon Street. Still, there was always that nagging sense of depression lingering in his head, just waiting for another opportunity to come to the forefront of his psyche once more. Luckily for Zachary, though, he found a pretty good antidote to any depressive feelings when he met Lana Shupak, a 28-year-old bartender and stripper from Dallas who worked in the same establishment as he had for a while. It was a whirlwind romance, so much so that after less than a year had passed, Lana would already have become pregnant with the couple's first child, Jackson. It was that revelation that led the mother-to-be to decide to stay with Zachary even after she'd learned he'd been lying about his age the whole time and was still only 18. But while impending fatherhood would have terrified many men in their teens, particularly those who were prone to depressive episodes, Zach jumped headfirst into the whole thing as he was excited about being a father. The way he saw it was precisely what he needed to give himself the motivation to be the best man he could be. So, not long after he found out about the pregnancy, he married Lana in October of 1998, in a ceremony held inside New Orleans' famous Jackson Square. When Lana got pregnant again not long after with their second child, Lily, he realized their income was not going to be enough to support a family. So he quit his job as a bartender, earned his GED at night school, and then signed up with the U.S. Army for an 8-year term. Sure, that would mean he'd be away from home for long periods, but as far as the new father was concerned, that was a necessary evil. The way he saw it, being in the military would allow him to provide for his son and daughter in a way he'd never been able to in his prior line of work. At one point, it would even allow them to all move to Europe, as Zachary was stationed in Germany in 2001, and he was able to bring Lana and the kids across the Atlantic to live with him. What he never accounted for, however, was the fact that, while there, his family would have a hard time adjusting and making friends. That was particularly difficult for Lana, especially after the wives of the other soldiers found out that she had been a stripper. As if that wasn't bad enough, once the father of two was sent to Iraq in 2002 following the events of 9/11, he would see some things that would have a significant adverse effect on his already fragile mental health. The horrors of war are very real, and that was something Zachary would learn very quickly while overseas. There was, however, one particular incident in Iraq that really took a toll on him. Essentially, what happened was that the army sergeant befriended a young Iraqi boy while serving there, one he took quite a shine to. But that would end in tragedy when his people found out he was talking to enemy Americans. That resulted in the child being executed by his own people. As you would expect, that incident left Zachary with a tremendous amount of guilt as he felt personally responsible for what had happened to the young boy. Really, at that point, he should have been given therapy of some kind in order to deal with the incident. But either because it was never offered to him or because he neglected to take it, that didn't happen. The situation instead was left to fester in his mind and make his already poor mental state all the worse. And it wouldn't get any better once he was discharged from the army sometime afterwards. The circumstances surrounding his exit from the military would actually leave Zachary in an even worse state of mind. The reason for that being that, rather than get an honorable discharge as he'd hoped he would, he had to settle for a general discharge instead. That was still considered a relatively positive way for him to part ways with the army, with the general discharge signifying that he had done a satisfactory job during his time of service. It did mean he would not be eligible to receive any future benefits, which would make life harder for his family going forward. So when he returned to New Orleans soon after to be with his family, things went south pretty quickly. Once Lana discovered that Zachary, as a result of his depression, had been deliberately failing physical fitness tests while overseas in an attempt to get sent home early, and that had been what had ultimately led to his general discharge, she was furious, as the whole point of him joining the military in the first place had been so that he'd have more money and benefits to provide for them in the long run. That put an incredible strain on their relationship. Basically, as far as Lana was concerned at that moment in time, the man she'd fallen in love with had died in the Middle East, and the man she was with then was someone entirely different. So it came as little surprise to those around them when they ended up separating soon after. With that separation came even more mental anguish for the former sergeant, which was only amplified when he was forced to go back to bartending in order to afford child support for his 2 kids. Many around him began to wonder if he wasn't suffering from undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder following everything he'd experienced in the military. While that could have been a pit he never managed to escape, Zachary ended up finding another lifeline while working on Bourbon Street. It was during his second spell there that he found love again when he met a young woman named Addie Hall. Addie had grown up on the opposite side of the country from Zachary, with her youth being spent in North Carolina. There she was raised by her veteran father and stay-at-home mother. While they may have been separated by many miles, Zachary and Addie shared a similar experience during their formative years, as, like him, she also struggled with mental health issues. As to what caused her mental health issues, well, that would be part and result of her coming of age in a pretty toxic and abusive household, one where sexual abuse was present. That's why she took the first opportunity she could to escape when she was old enough. It was that upbringing that led the young woman to New Orleans, as it was far enough away from her family that she felt she could be free of their shadow. But even if she was free of her parents, Addie still felt the after effects of her childhood once she'd relocated to her new home. While she was known to those around her as a free-spirited type of girl, someone who made friends easily and who thought of herself as not only an artist and a dancer, but also a poet and a seamstress, her fun-loving spark was frequently drowned out by bouts of depression. Those would often worsen due to her copious use of drugs and alcohol. Someone who would become tangentially crucial to the story further down the line was a friend of Addie's named Margaret Sanchez. She would explain that Addie's way of dealing with the abuse she'd experienced as a child, particularly the sexual abuse, was to try to drown out her feelings with substances that could put her at ease at least for a little while. But that was never a long-term fix for her, and it never stopped her from being drawn to abusive men who mistreated her, much like her father had. Those relationships would only further add to her mental health issues, to the point that at times those around her became genuinely concerned. She would become so low during those bouts of depression that many of her friends believed that she had to have had some form of undiagnosed bipolar disorder. That would make it difficult for her to maintain strong relationships of any kind while she was living and working in the New Orleans French Quarter. But by the time she met Zachary, it wasn't like she was very interested in having a romantic partner anymore, as by that point she'd become wary of men in general. That said, something seemed different to her about Zach. Perhaps it was the fact that he was a father and thus had the energy of someone who could provide for her. Maybe it was his easygoing exterior, or maybe it was just Addie sensing a kindred spirit in someone else who was struggling emotionally. Whatever the reason, she soon became smitten with him, and he would become just as smitten with her too. After all, with her bohemian attitude, her good looks, and her zest for life, she was everything he could have wanted. Sure, she was prone to drinking too much, and she was also known for getting a little aggressive whenever she was drunk, but the young father of two was willing to look the other way, as everything else about Addie was perfect as far as he could see. Really, it felt like she'd been made for him, and he for her. So it was almost a formality that not long after they started working together, sparks would fly and they'd end up in a relationship. As was expected from two young people working in the nightlife industry in a city like New Orleans, though, much of Zachary and Addie's relationship would revolve around them partying, with drugs and alcohol being a regular part of daily life for the pair. That led many of their friends to worry that a relationship built on such a tumultuous foundation was bound to be doomed. However, at least during those early days, the couple proved everyone wrong, as their bond ultimately proved strong enough to overcome any instability. Really, it felt like they were holding each other up in many ways, with their combined efforts transforming what should have been a disastrous situation into a happy home life. What neither of them could have seen coming, however, was just how tough things were going to get in the near future, and just how much the strength of their bond was going to be tested. That was because, in August of 2005, mere weeks after they had begun dating, the entire city of New Orleans would be rocked to its core by the coming of Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina would become known as one of the worst natural disasters in the U.S., although the damage done was exacerbated by inadequate maintenance on the levee system that was supposed to protect the city. The storm absolutely leveled the city over the course of a few weeks, causing an estimated $125 billion worth of damage, destroying as many as 80,000 housing units and killing around 2,000 people by the time all was said and done. Approximately 60,000 people would have to be rescued from the city in the immediate aftermath, and a staggering 80% of New Orleans would be left submerged underwater. Even to this day, New Orleans is still recovering from the incident in many ways, with large parts of the city remaining in a state of disrepair as of 2025, and many of the families displaced have never been able to return to their old homes, even now. Unsurprisingly, when news came that the storm was about to hit back in the summer of 2005, people quickly realized it could be a total disaster. Many of the citizens chose to evacuate the area and seek refuge elsewhere. However, that wasn't an option for everyone, especially those in lower-income situations. So Zachary and Addie felt the need to stay behind and help protect their community. It seemed especially necessary as crime was about to run rampant in the absence of a strong law enforcement presence. The couple chose not to evacuate and instead remained in the French Quarter, one of the few areas less affected by the flooding due to its being situated on higher ground. Of course, that wasn't the only reason they remained in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, though. No, they also didn't want to abandon their home, as it was the only one they knew anymore. It was, after all, the place they'd met and fallen in love. Even when Zachary's estranged wife Lana begged him to get out of town like she was doing with their children when they evacuated to Sugar Land, Texas, he refused. As far as he was concerned, if Addie wasn't going anywhere, then he wasn't going anywhere either. They would just have to ride things out as best they could and hope it didn't get too bad. Some around them saw that as an incredibly reckless decision, especially when 2 young children could be affected. But nothing was going to change the pair's minds, and their decision to remain in New Orleans throughout the storm's duration ultimately proved to be a good one for them, at least for a little while. While the actual hurricane itself was a terrifying experience to endure and the floods that followed were catastrophic, they seemed happy to be living in that post-apocalyptic environment as long as they were together. Even with there being no running water, electricity, or air conditioning in their area anymore, Zach and Addie thrived. That was because they were able to rally their community and bring everyone closer together, causing each person around them to feel like Noah stepping off the ark, ready to rebuild the world around them. Sometimes that meant checking in on neighbors who were struggling, and sometimes it meant heading over to abandoned bars and gathering up all the remaining alcohol so they could make cocktails outside their apartment, which they could then trade in exchange for food and water. That wasn't all they were doing to try to get things back on track for New Orleans. In one of the more unusual ways of making sure people were getting the help they needed, Addie would make a special effort to flash her breasts at any police cars that drove by her in Zachary's apartment. Her reasoning behind that was that it would keep the police coming back, and if anyone were in a sudden state of emergency, they'd be available quickly to help. A unique method of helping out? Sure, but an effective one nonetheless. And all that added together to make the couple minor celebrities in the French Quarter during the summer of 2005. So much so that locals would come to describe them as the king and queen of Katrina survivalists, and that eventually caught the attention of the media, leading to Zachary and Addie being photographed and interviewed for several newspapers, including the New York Times. That said, the newfound celebrity wasn't particularly important to either of them. No, neither of them were doing any of that for any kind of fame. Instead, they just wanted to help keep their community afloat. If anything, to the young couple, the whole thing was more of an adventure than anything else, and they secretly hoped the adventure would never end. Really, if Zachary and Addie could have had their own way, things would have remained that way forever, with them leading their small community as if it were from a bygone century. It felt to them like all the worries of the modern world, the concerns that had contributed towards their mental health problems, had all been washed away in the flood, and now things were right. All that mattered anymore was that they had each other, and if civilization never returned, then so be it. But alas, civilization would slowly start to return to New Orleans over the weeks and months that followed, and that caused an unwelcome reality to seep back into their lives once more. Unsurprisingly, once that happened, cracks started to form in their relationship, and that led things to fall into a downward spiral. Really, it was just such a painful thing for the couple to be ripped back into their old lives again. Lives in which they had responsibilities like having to hold down jobs, pay child support, or just endure the general drudgery of the rat race. It certainly had an effect on their mental health, with each of them falling back into bouts of depression. And that depression was only exacerbated by the amount of drugs and alcohol they were consuming as they returned to their old party lifestyle. That time with even greater intensity. In particular, it was cocaine that became their substance of choice during that period. And according to those who knew them, that would help to create an atmosphere of paranoia and irritability, which saw Zachary and Addie get into fights often. Not just in the verbal sense, but in the physical sense too. And when they weren't fighting, well, they were usually breaking up. By that point, Zach and Addie had become that couple we've all known at some stage in our lives who always seemed to be separating and getting back together again. After a while, even their friends weren't sure what their relationship status was on any given day. Of course, it wasn't just each other they were causing problems for by then, though. No, on at least one occasion, Addie would find herself getting arrested when, in a drunken stupor, she pulled a gun on a man in the French Quarter one morning. That led to her getting charged with aggravated assault with a firearm. Unsurprisingly, once about 6 months had passed with them constantly being on and off, fighting and not fighting, creating mayhem for the local populace and rarely ever being sober, their landlord decided enough was enough and kicked them out. When that happened, Zach finally decided that he had had enough too. Instead of breaking up with her right away, though, he felt the best way to handle the situation was to have an affair with another woman behind Addie's back. She didn't end up finding out about it until they were about to move into a new apartment together in the French Quarter on North Rampart Street. Even when she discovered her boyfriend's infidelity, however, Addie did not make it known to him right away. She also didn't put a stop to them moving to a new home. Instead, she chose to continue with the move as she had developed a plan to get back at him. The plan involved them setting up in their new lodgings located above the locally famous voodoo spiritual temple, all while unbeknownst to Zachary requesting to the landlord that his name not be put on the lease. Basically, what she was hoping to do was convince Zach to cover the first 2 months of rent, which had to be paid in advance as part of the lease agreement. Then, once that was done, she would kick Zach out, revealing to him that she knew all about his cheating. However, as far as the landlord was concerned, that was a personal matter they were hesitant to get involved with. That's why they advised Addie to take a few days to discuss things with Zach and see if they could resolve the issue before any changes were made to the contract. Ultimately, though, that couple of days changed nothing. By then, Addie was already convinced of what she wanted to do. She was, after all, a woman who had several bad experiences with men in the past, so she had developed a zero-tolerance policy when it came to situations like the one she was in. And that's why she returned to her landlord once the time had passed and told them she hadn't changed her mind. At that point, the landlord acquiesced to her request and put the finalized version of the lease under her name and her name only. Once everything was signed and formalized on October 5th, 2006, Addie told Zachary that she was breaking up with him, for good that time, and that she was kicking him out of the house, something he did not take too well. Feeling utterly betrayed, he tried speaking to their landlord, asking them, quote, "Did you just let her sign a lease alone? Because I'm screwed. I'm totally messed up now. She's trying to kick me out of our apartment." And when that didn't lead to things getting sorted out, he returned to Addie even angrier than before. Of course, angry arguments were nothing new to the couple by that point. It was pretty much their normal state in many ways, as was the fact that, as this particular argument broke out, both were already pretty intoxicated. Unlike other evenings, though, even those in the past where things had gotten physical, there was something different about this fight. Perhaps it was the realization that it really was the end of the line for their relationship. Something snapped inside of Zachary that evening. He started strangling Addie, and he decided he wasn't going to stop until she was dead. Addie tried to fight back when that happened, no doubt fully understanding just how much trouble she was in. But with her partner easily being able to overpower her, it wasn't much of a battle. It would be quick, all things considered, albeit not painless. Once the deed was done and Addie was lying dead on the floor of their apartment, Zachary's world would be changed forever. What was he going to do? How had he allowed things to get to that point? What would the police say when they found out? Those were no doubt some of the questions that were running through his mind in the immediate aftermath of the murder. But obviously none of them were enough to snap any sense into him because, clearly in a deeply broken state psychologically by then, his next move was to allegedly have sex with Addie's corpse and fall asleep on the floor next to her. Needless to say, those were not the actions of a man who was in full control of his faculties anymore. Whatever mental health issues had been swirling around in his mind over the course of several years, they had fully taken a hold now. At that point, he was entirely out of touch with reality. So out of touch that the following morning, when he woke up next to Addie's slowly decomposing corpse, he still didn't feel the need to do anything about her body. Instead, he calmly got dressed and headed out to work, leaving her there to rot on the floor. And that was the way things continued for the next few days, with him going about his daily life as if nothing had happened, all while those around him were blissfully unaware that a murderer was walking in their midst or that the body of his victim remained on display on the floor of his apartment. Some had indeed commented on the fact that he seemed a little out of sorts during those days, but given the amount of drugs and alcohol he was known to consume by that point, and given how rocky his relationship with Addie often was, no one took it as anything particularly unusual. As far as they saw it, the couple had probably just had another fight, which might explain why no one had seen Addie for a couple of days, as it was entirely possible she'd gone to stay with some friends. When it came to what Zachary was thinking as the days progressed, though, it's hard to say exactly what was going through his mind. One thing that does appear to be clear, however, is that it doesn't seem like there was much in the way of him accepting what had happened. If anything, it seems as if Zachary was doing his best to try and mentally suppress the events of October 5th, something that must have been particularly hard to do given the fact that there was a visual reminder staring him right in the face every time he returned home. Perhaps that's why, after a few days had passed, he decided it was time to dispose of the body. Or perhaps it was because Addie's corpse was starting to smell and he was worried the neighbors would notice. Whatever the reason, eventually Zach did realize that something was going to have to be done about his deceased partner. And as he certainly had no intention of turning himself in by handing her over to the police, he was going to have to improvise. So he set about formulating a plan that began with him carrying Addie's body into their bathtub and cutting her up with a knife and a hacksaw. After that, he took the parts of her body he'd cut off, extremities like her arms, legs, and head, and either stored them in the couple's refrigerator or put them in a pot and cooked them up on the stove. Of course, there was a twisted logic to Zachary doing that, though. Demented as it might have been, he believed that Addie's flesh would come off her bones more easily once she had been boiled, making it easier to dispose of her remains. So, less than a week after he'd murdered the love of his life, Zachary now found himself in a situation where he had her head in a large pot on the front of the stove, her hands and feet on the back burner, her arms and legs roasting in the oven, and her torso being kept cool in the fridge so that it could be dealt with later. To say that was like something out of Hannibal Lecter's playbook would be an understatement. But unlike Hannibal Lecter, there was no cannibalism going on, though that's what the police would initially suspect was happening when they discovered the scene sometime thereafter. It appears the severity of that particular part of the plan was finally able to breach Zachary's broken brain just a little bit and bring him somewhat back to reality for a moment. Understandably, once the reality started seeping back into his world, the guilt he felt was overwhelming. Still, all he could do then was keep trying to hide what he had done, going about his daily life as normally as he could while he continued to prepare Addie's body for disposal. But no matter how hard he tried to hide things, those around him could tell something was wrong, even by his standards. He was just a little too quiet and was acting more strangely than usual, and whenever one of his and Addie's mutual friends would ask about where she was, he remained unusually coy about the situation, only sharing that they had had an argument and that she had gone back to North Carolina to be with her family for a while. To some, that seemed plausible enough, as Addie's own mental health issues had always made her unpredictable and prone to sudden flights of fancy. Plus, if she and Zachary really did have a fight, it was understandable that she might want to put some distance between them for a while. It wouldn't be like it was the first time such a thing had happened. But to others who knew the couple, something rang false about that claim, though they couldn't quite put their finger on why they felt that way at the time. Obviously, as they would eventually learn, the reason they doubted whatever Zachary was telling them was because he was lying. But that wouldn't be revealed in time for him to face any repercussions for his crime. Before the full extent of what he'd done could be revealed to the world, guilt would overcome him and he chose to take his own life instead. But before he went out, he would allow himself something equating happiness for his last few days as he would empty out his bank account and go on the bender to end all benders. One that included lots of drugs, alcohol, and women. As he would later describe it himself in his suicide note, quote, "I've known forever how horrible of a person I am, ask anyone, and decided to quit my job and spend the $1,500 cash I had being happy until I killed myself. So that's what I did. Good food, good drugs, good strippers, good friends, and any loose ends I may have had. I didn't contact any of my family, so that'll explain the shock, and had a fantastic time living out my days. It's just about time now." Now reading that note, it may seem hard to reconcile the idea that Zach had a lot of guilt over what he had done. After all, for someone who had just murdered the love of his life, Zachary seemed pretty happy to spend a large part of what remained of his money sleeping with local prostitutes. However, by then, he had somewhat come to his senses and could see reality once more. But attributing the mentality of a rational man just doesn't work here. As a result of the combination of the depression he'd suffered as a child, plus the apparent post-traumatic stress disorder he'd developed while in the military, as well as the effects of his drug-fueled, emotionally unstable lifestyle during his later months with Addie, his mind was, by that point, operating in a way that no mentally healthy person would. And that would become even more apparent when his money finally ran dry. As it was at that point, with nothing left, Zachary decided it was finally time to end it all. So, on October 17th of that same year, he started by harming to the point that he left 28 cigarette burns over his body, one for each year of his life he'd been a failure. Then he wrote a suicide note where he confessed to everything, headed over to the Omni Royal Hotel at 621 St. Louis Street and used whatever pennies he had left there to get drunk at the rooftop bar. Once that was done, he calmly walked over to the edge of the roof, climbed over the banister, and jumped, falling 130 feet or 40 meters to his immediate death. While that may have been the end of the story for Zachary Bowen, it most certainly was not the end of the story for everyone else. They had to deal with the grisly aftermath of the situation. That aftermath would begin when police arrived on the scene at the Omni Royal Hotel soon after and, upon inspecting the deceased's body, found his army dog tags and his suicide note in his back pocket. On top of the full confession to the murder and subsequent dismemberment of Addie Hall, the note also clarified, quote, "This is not accidental. I had to take my own life to pay for the one I took. If you send a patrol car to 826 North Rampart, you will find the dismembered corpse of my girlfriend Addie in the oven, on the stove, and in the fridge, and a full signed confession from myself." So armed with that knowledge as well as the key to the apartment, which was in Zachary's front pocket, officers went straight over to the address listed. There they found a truly horrific scene awaiting them, with one of the first things they noticed being the random thoughts of the killer, which he had spray painted across the walls in the aftermath of Addie's death. Included amongst those thoughts were statements like, "I love her," "I'm a total failure," "Please help me stop the pain," and "Look in the oven," each of which seemed to signify a man whose mental state had by that point fallen way beyond the point of no return. And as if that wasn't enough, the thermostat inside the apartment had been turned down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. That made it pretty cold inside to help slow down the body's decomposition, thereby keeping it from smelling as bad. Addie's body, or the butchered and charred remains of it, were still sitting there, waiting for authorities to find it. That was precisely what they discovered next as they walked into the kitchen, doing so as per the instructions spray-painted on the wall. Of course, before they even had a chance to look in the oven and there discover Addie's well-cooked arms and legs, they would see her head as well as her hands and feet still sitting in pots on the stove. Her torso remained in the fridge, just as Zachary had left it. Basically, it was like a scene from a horror movie. So, unsurprisingly, the officers who were there were left shocked and disgusted by what they'd stumbled upon, with some of them struggling to accept what was in front of them. After all, while they'd all seen some pretty nasty things in the past, this was another level of savagery altogether. And as they tried to figure out how such a massacre could have happened, one of them discovered the additional confession note from the killer, the one that explained the rest of the details of his crime. As it was written in Addie's journal by Zachary, quote, "Today is Monday 16 October 2 a.m. I killed her at 1 a.m. Thursday 5 October. I very calmly strangled her. It was very quick. Halfway through the task I stopped and thought about what I was doing. The decision to halt the first idea and move to Plan B, the crime scene you are now in, came after a while. I scared myself not by the action of calmly strangling the woman I've loved for 1.5 years and then desecrating her body, but by my entire lack of remorse. I've known for forever how horrible of a person I am, ask anyone, and decided to quit my job and spend the $1,500 cash I had being happy until I killed myself. So that's what I did. Good food, good drugs, good strippers, good friends, and any loose ends I may have had. I didn't contact any of my family, so that'll explain the shock. I had a fantastic time living out my days. It's just about time now." Aside from that, the only thing Zachary had left for investigators was an additional note spray painted on the wall, one that included contact information for Lana Shupak. It's assumed he wanted the mother of his children to be informed about what had happened to them before she read about it in the news. Needless to say, Lana would be immensely surprised when she learned of the murder. As far as she had known, Zachary and Addie had very much been in love, and while she knew her ex-husband could be prone to depressive episodes and could be pretty erratic mentally, there was nothing about him that suggested to her that he could be capable of murder, especially such a violent murder. At the end of the day, though, what everyone wanted to know was why. What could have happened to cause him to do such a thing to someone he loved so much? Had it been, as some people speculated at the time, some kind of demonic possession that had taken hold of Zachary? Their apartment was located directly above the Voodoo Spiritual Temple, after all, and there were rumors going around in the immediate aftermath that argued that the killer had eaten some of the victim's remains, with that obviously being the real reason he'd been cooking her body parts. But while some people clung to that idea, perhaps because it was in some strange way more comforting than confronting the truth, the reality was that it was just a case of a broken man suffering from a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. Unfortunately, when he finally reached his breaking point, he'd done something he could never take back. No magic was involved and no demons were present. There was just a human being who'd made the gravest of mistakes. That has led many to feel a degree of sympathy for Zachary in the years following. Sure, what he did was unforgivable, and there were those who simply could not look past that and see a path towards having any kind of pity for the man. But for others, while his crimes were horrific, just labeling him a cold-blooded killer is doing the situation an injustice, as it's not looking at the full scale of what occurred. Given the mental state Zach was in, particularly after his time serving in the military, it's easy to see how the grisly events of October 5th, 2006 and the subsequent events of October 17th happened. And not just those events either, because there would be another similar case that happened less than a decade later, which was tangentially connected to this one in a sense that it was a murder carried out by an old friend of Zachary and Addie's. That's right, it was in 2012 that Margaret Sanchez would kill and dismember a local Bourbon Street dancer named Jaron Lockhart in a manner that was eerily close to what had happened 6 years prior. That was something Margaret would bring up when she was later interviewed by the police, with her saying of Jaron Lockhart, quote, "I felt so bad for her family because I had a friend. My friend was Addie Hall. She was cut up and cooked and her boyfriend jumped off a hotel." Of course, while this incident can't directly be blamed on Zachary, it is worth noting that Margaret was also a woman known to struggle with mental health issues throughout her life, And though her emotional struggles came less from military service and more from other factors, it's just another glaring sign that if such a thing can happen twice in the same area, only 6 years apart, with two people who knew each other, then there's a larger problem to be tackled when it comes to helping people with severe mental disorders. Really, if there's any kind of silver lining to be taken from these tragedies, it's that they only highlighted the need for there to be more care made readily available to those suffering from mental health issues, particularly those who are suffering from serious cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, as that is a condition that affects far too many today who have served in the military. If, for example, there had been a better system in place that allowed Zachary to gain access to therapy in the immediate aftermath of his time serving his country, then he might not have continued to fall apart mentally. And if that had happened, it's possible, if not probable, that things would have never reached the point they had, with two people ending up dead and one of those people being cut up into chunks and cooked post-mortem. Not only that, but two children might still have their father with them today. It's not like this situation is an isolated incident either. According to a 2014 study carried out in the JAMA Psychiatric Medical Journal, as many as 1 in 4 active duty military members have shown signs of suffering from a mental health condition following their time serving. Sure, very few of those people have gone on to kill someone, but plenty have ended up taking lives. And even those who have survived have often had to struggle greatly with holding down employment or even keeping a roof over their heads, in large part because the right network of support has not been put into place for them to get their lives back on track. It doesn't matter if it's a case of post-traumatic stress disorder, a general sense of depression, or even something like a head injury picked up while in action. All of those things can have a major impact on the life of a person for the rest of their lives if they're not given the correct care. That's why it's so important that the help that's in place, such as the Veterans Crisis Hotline, which is available to any former military person who finds themselves struggling, is promoted as much as possible. Even something as simple as that could stop a situation like the murder-suicide of Zachary Bowen and Addie Hall from taking place again. Still, though, while this is an important first step, there remains a lot of work to be done to ensure that more is put in place to guarantee better support for veterans. After all, if you're putting your life on the line for your country, then the least you could ask for in return is that you be taken care of after you return home, and taken care of in a way that protects not just you, but those around you. So as much as some people don't like me calling people with mental health issues monsters, and I do believe that the US government could have done much more to help Zachary, he is still the person who cut Addie into pieces and cooked her remains. At the end of the day, that will always be monstrous behavior. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.